might move more.
Yeah. Hello. We are now live with currently 8 attendees. Fantastic. Cool. So today we have Andre Mihaly and Andrew Pilash, and they're going to be talking about the latest updates in the Payara platform in the last release. Andre and then Andrew, and then we'll get into it. Brilliant. So over to you, Andre.
Okay, hello.
If you still
Welcome in the webinar. We're going to talk about the new features in Payara Platform version 5.183. It was released recently. And we'll go first quickly through the new features, and then we'll also demonstrate them in codes. So I'll share my slides here. Okay. So it's going to be me who's starting, although I'm on the right side. I'm Andre Mihaly. I'm a Java developer and also service engineer in Payara, working for Payara services. And with me, there's Andrew Pilash, who is a Java developer and working as an engineer for Payara services. So mostly my job is to support customers and support the community. And he also does community support and works deep dive in the Payara server source code. So as I said, we will be talking about new features, and we have most of them are listed on this slide. So the majority of the new features come from MicroProfile updates, which are mostly updates to existing APIs to make them in line with MicroProfile 2.0 version. Then there's support for OpenID Connect in the security engine. Then we also added some improvements to administration console. Mostly to match the updates to MicroProfile APIs and allow configuring MicroProfile in a more convenient way. And we also added support for a new application descriptor called Payara-Web, which supersedes the Glassfish descriptor and adds new features on top of the Glassfish schema. So to go through the MicroProfile 2.0 updates, there were updates to configuration, two-way authentication, OpenTracing, fault tolerance, and the REST client. All of them were updated in the recent release except REST client, which was already present in the previous release of Payara Platform. But it was the only specification from MicroProfile 2.0 which was supported by the previous version of Payara Platform. Now you can enjoy all the APIs from MicroProfile 2.0. In configuration 1.3, there was added new support for new converters from string to URI, but also to any other class that has a string that has a constructor that accepts a string. So basically, you can convert configuration values to any class that can be constructed from a string. And then we added also mapping rule for environment variables, which means that even characters which are not allowed in environment variable names can be used in configuration properties, and these can be defined by the environment variables. The way how it works is that you can specify a dash or underscore, not dash, it's underscore instead of all these invalid characters, and environment variables with underscores will be mapped to keys, which can have any other invalid character. GUID authentication adds a more portable way to specify public keys using MicroProfile config. Payara Platform allowed to specify public keys even within earlier versions, but it wasn't portable. And now it uses MicroProfile config keys to specify either full content of a public key or a location of a file that contains the public key. And there are also some other values that you can configure using MicroProfile config, such as the issuer. Then there were improvements in OpenTracing, which was largely just improved to be in line with the OpenTracing specification 0.31. It might be confusing that both are called OpenTracing, but the MicroProfile OpenTracing is the Java API within the MicroProfile project, and OpenTracing itself is a specification outside of MicroProfile, which specifies how tracing information should be collected, and also offers some plain Java APIs to collect tracing information. This API is used also in MicroProfile OpenTracing and enhanced to better fit into dependency injection and other MicroProfile APIs. And MicroProfile OpenTracing also specifies that a tag is added to indicate which component the trace came from, which is not mandated by the standard OpenTracing specification itself. And there were also improvements in fault tolerance 1.1, mostly integration with other MicroProfile APIs. The most notable is the metrics integration, which means that there are multiple metrics collected and exposed about execution of fault tolerance interceptors. So you can collect numbers about how many times fault tolerance methods annotated with fault tolerance annotations were executed, what is the status of the circuit breaker, how many retries were done, how many failures, and the like. You can also provide parameters for the fault tolerance annotations with MicroProfile config, where there is this specific format of the configuration key that can be used to specify parameters for each annotation and each class or method they are added to. And you can also retrieve some additional failure metadata in fallback execution when there is an error in calling the method. REST Client 1.1 basically adds asynchronous support when calling REST services. It allows to have methods which return a completion stage and can be followed, or their execution can be followed in another thread in an asynchronous way. There's also support for setting URI as a parameter in addition to URL when you have a REST client interface and you want to inject it, and you need to specify either URI or URL as a MicroProfile config key, because there is no other way to provide the URL of the service when you inject the interface. In programmatic way, you can do that with the methods of the builder. So I'll go quickly to the code to see in action what can be done now with MicroProfile in Payara Platform 5.183. I'm using NetBeans, and all my examples are run in Payara Micro, but they can also be executed on Payara Server. I'll start with demonstrating how to use type-safe REST client. So here in this example, we have a root resource, which is our entry point to the service. And we want to call another service called hello service to retrieve a complete hello greeting. So instead of programmatically assembling the path and parameters of the REST request, we can just create an interface. We call it hello client. And the interface uses standard JAX-RS annotations. This is not new in MicroProfile. It was added in the first version of REST client. So I'm just going quickly through what's necessary. We specify a path within the context root. We specify the media type of the response, which is now text plain because we just return a simple string. And we need to register or enable this client to be injected with this @register REST client. You can also specify the scope of the injected client. And the rest is just methods we want to call and mapping of the methods and their arguments to the URL that will be used to access the service. We can then simply inject this interface to any CDI bean with @inject REST client and use it. We can also inject path, URI path, and construct the hello client interface programmatically with a builder. The REST client builder allows us to specify the URL and then build the proxy out of the interface. Then we can just call it in the same way. You may have noticed that in this injection scenario, we didn't specify the value of the URL. This is because it's not possible to do it in code. It's expected that the URL of the service is passed as a MicroProfile configuration key, and we can do it within our application with MicroProfile-config properties. When I open the file, you can see that I used the fully qualified name of the interface and appended /mprest and /URL. URL is the name of the attribute I want to specify. mprest is just a static constant part which we need to add so that the container treats it as a configuration for the MicroProfile REST client. So this is the way how we can configure URL of our hello client to be injected into our code, and then we can just use it as a normal interface. We can call a method, and this in fact is not a normal method, but it gets changed into a REST call and invokes a REST service, and on the other side there the REST service responds with a string. If we want to process the response asynchronously, we can we can use the new feature in MicroProfile 2.0 to return a completion stage. Here is an example of asynchronous hello client, which has a method that returns completion stage. So it's not just a string, but a stage, which means that sometime in the future the string value will be available. If we call such a method, it doesn't wait for the response, but returns immediately with the completion stage. And we can also change some handlers on with the completion stage interface to do something with the result when it's available. But this all is executed only after we get the response. While the method hello, the resource method, returns almost immediately. And the container knows that if the resource method returns completion stage again, it should wait until the completion stage finishes. So here in this example, we have two completion stages. One is returned from the hello client, which means that there is a REST call ongoing and we are waiting for the result. And another completion stage is returned from the REST server REST resource, which means that our container waits for some action to be finished before it sends the response back to the browser or back to the REST client. To demonstrate this live, let's go to the application. We just go to the root of the application. We will just get the normal response, hello everybody, just to demonstrate the programmatic way we issue the proc path, which uses the other way of calling a REST client with a programmatic way, which is this hello programmatic. And when we request the async resource, we get the response, but now we also have some information about in which thread the response started and in which thread it completed. If we go to the code of the asynchronous response, here in the beginning of the resource method, we have a log message. And we also add the information about the current thread into the response. This is done after the response is ready, but it prints the name of the thread which started the response. Then there is a filter which is executed after the resource method is completed and before the response is sent. And it also logs information about request finished, and it adds information about the current thread into the response. And that materializes with different thread names in the response. While this one was collected before the REST client call was issued, this one was collected after the REST client call finished. You can see it's in different threads. Now, let's jump into the fault tolerance demo. If we want to make our REST calls more robust, we can use fault tolerance annotations to issue some retries or to trigger in circuit breaker pattern to avoid calling a service which is unstable. And we can do it just with plain annotations on a method. We just need to edit to the method of a class, which is a CDI object, while it still doesn't work on the client. So if we edit it on the interface, it wouldn't work yet. There are plans in MicroProfile to support this, but it's not out of the box because the interface is not a CDI bean, and in interceptor annotations doesn't work there yet. So we need to annotate a method on a class, which wraps the hello client call. And with this example, we put retry annotation, which means that a call will be retried by default 3 times. You see that max retries is 3. We can override max retries with this annotation, with this attribute. But we can also override it in the MicroProfile configuration. So we don't have to change the codes to make our application afterwards. And we can also provide a fallback method when everything fails and there's no way how to call the remote service. Then another method called handle in this class will be called. We can also specify a class if we want to call something outside of our class. And we would need to specify a handler that implements fallback handler. And it's very convenient to just call another method in the same class. And this method will just print client failed, but still return a valid OK response from our application. So to demonstrate this, we'll call the fail endpoint, and we go to the debugger. We will see that the status is 200, which means that everything is okay, except the message says something went wrong, and we're presenting only a fallback message instead of the full result. This is because we're calling getFailing method now just to simulate a service that doesn't work well. It's somewhere. Hello client. There's also an implementation of the service. Hello resource. This is the server side of the service, and it throws exception just to simulate the service which isn't working properly. But to see that something happened in the background, I'll now access the metrics endpoint of the service, which is always available at the URL, at the main URL. And we have to add metrics at the end. If we just issue this call, we will get responsive formats that can be consumed with Prometheus, but it's not very easy to read. So I will request type JSON, and now it's easier to see what's happening and what was in the response. And we can see that the application now adds metrics for our fault tolerance annotations added to react to failures method. And the metric says that we call the method twice. It was retried 6 times in total, so it means 3 times per each request. And the fallback was called twice in total, which means it failed twice, which is fine because the service always fails. And here is how many times the retry failed, which means that it retried several times until max retries, and even then it was still failing, so it reported a failure. So with this way, you can easily see what's going on in your application. And even though that your application works fully okay, you can see that in the background, the fault tolerance interceptors did some job to keep your application robust and recover from failures. Yeah, so I'm giving the word to Andy to talk about other features. Andy, are you there?
Andre, just one question from David, who just asks if the source example can be shared.
Once again?
David in the chat just asks if the source example can be shared. Is there a way we can do that perhaps afterwards? I can send it in an email.
Source example can be shared? Yeah, you mean the source?
I think what you...
yeah, I can share the sources, of course. I just worked on it until today, so I haven't shared them publicly, but I can share the demo too. Are there any other questions?
Okay.
There is in the Q&A. There's a chat and a Q&A.
There's a Payara version.
Nice.
The question
yes, David had another question. That's it, you got it.
Yeah. So the version we're talking about today is the recent version, Payara 5.183, which implements MicroProfile to 0 and also other features we're talking about today.
Okay, brilliant.
I should. Where's my? Where? Can you actually hear me over that one, or should I load up my mic?
I can unmute you.
You can unmute me. Yeah, but you need to mute, otherwise we'll get an echo.
Use
Yeah, it's probably the best one on the mic than the laptop one. Right, share my screen. Spoilers. Is it chat?
Yeah.
Yes.
I can see
awesome. Right, so I'm going to take over and talk about, leading nicely on from Andre's thing to some of the admin console improvements. And hopefully one of them that you can see straight away is we've alphabetized this config list. We had a couple of people, myself included, I have to admit, who did get a little annoyed by how sporadically things were dotted around a bit and that it seemed to be no order. And that's because there was no order. So we put it in alphabetical order, which should hopefully make finding things a little easier and quicker once you get used to the fact that things are actually in alphabetical order. I know for myself that I kept going to find request tracing here and it wasn't, which annoyed me. And then the new thing, the big headline for the admin console is we've now got admin console integration for all the MicroProfile stuff. So for some of them, it's obviously a little bare bones in that, for example, fault tolerance, there's not much to configure. That's more of an API side of things of you put it in your code and it just works. But there are options, for example, had I multiple managed executor services, I could select which one was going to be used by fault tolerance, because fault tolerance does use managed executor services for a number of things, one of them being timeouts. The big one is config, which is also the most complicated one, where you can start configuring the ordinals if you want the different config sources to be coming from different, to have a different priority, because that's what the ordinals do. You can also, which is the one I like, you can see the properties. And to save just blowing up the admin console every time you load this page, it's split into the different sources. So you've got the domain source, you've got the application source. So I've got just a tiny application installed, good old vulnerable cluster JSP. So you can see some properties here. You can edit them if you so wish. You have from the config, as in from these actual configs here. So you can apply properties directly to those. I should also mention, as far off the top of my head, none of this is new in 1.3. This is actually just admin console integration. So hopefully you all know roughly what you're doing. You've got modules here. If you've got so this is similar to application, but if you've got an ear with multiple modules, then you can set them for the individual wires or jars inside. And then server, which obviously points to a server. The difference between that and config being that for a server, it's mapped to a single instance. For a config, you can have multiple instances running off the same config. So if I had, say, Standy1 or Insty1 and Insty2 both running off Insty1 config, I could just make a setting here, and that would apply to both. And then there is also this directory, which is the one for the directory config source, so the secret stuff. Already talked about fault tolerance. Health check. You can now change where things are. So before it was always bound to 8080, oh, sorry, not to 8080, to the HTTP port and /health, which is in alignment with the MicroProfile health spec. But for those of you who so wish to move it, you can actually enable or disable it and change the port, sorry, not the port, the URL, which is what I've done on here's one I made earlier. If things moved out of the way, on instance 1. So I changed it to healthy. And there you see healthy. It's changed. Metrics. Much the same, there's not much to configure. It's enabled or disabled. So in this case, I've actually got it disabled. But you can also restrict it to only be available over HTTPS, which was new, I believe. Again, OpenAPI, enabled or disabled. And then OpenTracing is actually done through the request tracing service because we've tied them together. And so that's actually just a link to here. Although having seen that, I might stick the enabled button on there anyway, but leave that link. Oh God, what are they doing? Oh, no, not back. Wrong button. We'll cut this out in post. Ah, yes. Slides. Do I actually have the slides? That's the question. I don't. Where are the slides? Why isn't it in my recent thing? Ah. Sorry, I jumped ahead a bit and got chastised by Andre and Jaden. Wait, that's not what I just clicked. What? That is what I clicked. That's a different thing. You ignore that. There we go. Why did it open that other one? No, maybe I'm just... so yes, jumping ahead a bit. Where's the present button? Or is it already? I'll leave it. So that is largely the admin console changes, actually. So hopefully you can make use of that. And with that, I'm going to pass it back to Andre, who will now talk about the Payara-Web.xml deployment descriptor.
Okay.
I'll remute myself so we don't get echoes.
Okay, thanks, Andy. I'm going to continue with other features. And one of the new features, which is not entirely new, but it's much nicer than what we supported before, is support for Payara-Web.xml deployment descriptor, which adds additional Payara-specific configuration on top of Web.xml in the web applications. Before it was supported via the Glassfish Web.xml descriptor, which was inherited from the Glassfish server. We kept adding new features into the Glassfish Web.xml descriptor while still keeping the old schema, which was kind of breaking the XML if you wanted to validate it with the Glassfish schema. But now you can use Payara-Web.xml instead of Glassfish Web.xml. If you use them together, Payara-Web.xml will be picked instead of Glassfish. Right now you can use Glassfish web content in Payara-Web.xml, except it should point to a different schema, and the root tag is called Payara-Web app instead of Glassfish web app. But otherwise, there's nothing new added into Payara-Web.xml. But I want to highlight that we previously added some new features into Glassfish Web.xml, which are also supported in Payara-Web.xml. So Payara-Web.xml now supports more than Glassfish Web.xml in Glassfish server. What do we have then? We have OpenID Connect, which, well, I'll leave to Andy to show. But first, I will show you what I mean by Payara-XML in the demo. So here, if you look into the left side of the screen in the Maven project, you can find WebInf folder, which contains the standard Web.xml descriptor. Just for an example, it configures session timer to 30 seconds. You can see there's also Glassfish Web.xml, which adds additional configuration supported by both Glassfish server and Payara server. And then there is Payara-Web, which can contain all that's supported in Glassfish Web.xml, but can now have some more, can support some more elements. And you also have a schema that represents these new changes. So you get in decent ID, you get completion in the editor. Like, for example, scanning, exclude and include, and while these are new, and although in Payara server you can also add them here in the Glassfish XML, but the editor wouldn't know that they are valid, so it may give him some warnings and all the completion wouldn't work. So that's why we created a separate file where you can nicely write new changes, validate them, new options, validate them with the schema, and get auto completion for free. An example is this scan and exclude annotation, which is used to disable CDS scanning of for dependency injection in some libraries. So just to demo this quickly, I added a new dependency into our application, which is a general purpose Guava library from Google, which doesn't support dependency injection at all, and there's not CDI in Java E and MicroProfile. And we don't need to scan it for dependency injection, for beans to inject. And this would, for one, it would decrease the deployment time and start time of our application. For another thing, it can even avoid some errors when dependency injection is triggered on the code, which doesn't expect to be injected. So with this, we have a Guava library in our final WAR file. We see the content of the WAR somewhere here, web, inf, lib. And there are more jars pulled in with the Guava library, but mostly we are now interested in only in the Guava library. And we can either specify inclusion for Guava and use asterisk as the rest, so to exclude all the versions of the Guava library. but we can also exclude all the dependencies brought in with Guava and just allow dependency scanning in our own packages that we created, which is Webinar or whatever you use for your own code. And so this is quite useful if you want to improve the startup times for bigger applications or avoid problems in third-party libraries. Yeah, I'm giving the word to Andy if there are no questions to talk about OpenID Connect and to wrap up.
Hi, Andre. Yeah, there are two questions, both from Sankaraman. He asks, can applications running on Glassfish currently run in Payara without making migration-related changes?
Short answer is depends.
Yeah, that is right. But compared to other application servers, it's very easy to migrate from Glassfish to Payara. And it's also quite probable that you won't need to do any code changes, or very few. I think we have a testimonial from our customer who said that it was quite recently that migrating from Glassfish to Payara was very easy, much easier than they expected.
Okay, and then the second question is, has Payara already started making Jakarta EE related provisioning?
That's probably a question for Andy, although I'm not sure what is meant by provisioning.
Yeah, I'm not entirely sure about.
But we are definitely looking at the new donation of Glassfish source code and investigating how we can move Glassfish forwards within Jakarta and then keep it in sync with Payara server. So once Jakarta EE specifications are ready, we can implement them in Payara server by pulling the components from Glassfish.
Yes, sorry, to cut across, there's a delay. Yeah, so for the first Jakarta EE, it is actually just the idea of the very first release is as humanly possible to the Java EE8 release. So depending on what you mean by provisioning, are we getting ready for any changes? There are unlikely to actually be any changes. It would just be which dependencies we're pulling from. Ideally, it shouldn't actually break anything. The only thing that's changing really is that the package names will possibly change, which should just be a case of drop it in. Should. Fingers crossed.
Cool. All right.
But that's a ways away anyway, because I don't think the first release of Jakarta EE is. I think the very first release is scheduled for the end of this year, but whether they stick to it is a different question. There's a lot of legal stuff happening.
I think that the TCK or the compatibility testing suite for Java EE was donated to Jakarta, so but it was very recently, so we plan to see how Payara server can be executed against this test suite, and once it's turned into a Jakarta EE compatibility suite, we will definitely try to pass the test suite because we already provide Java EE 8 functionality, so it should be rather straightforward to pass Jakarta EE 8 test suite, which is because the functionality is the same more or less. So yeah, that definitely when it's possible to run the Jakarta EE test suite, we will definitely try it and make sure it passes the test suite and that we can certify it for Jakarta EE.
don't know to answer that one, Sebastian. My gut reaction to that is there's a number of things that could cause that kind of issue. I haven't seen it happen on my machine, so hashtag works on my machine, which is why I say it could be a number of issues that causes that. Can you see that one, Andre? It's in the chat rather than in the Q&A.
No. Do you mean the data grids, the question? So maybe we can just shortly say what the question is. So the question is about issues when running Payara in the data grids, and that it shows the instances in the data grids, but it doesn't show them as running. So I think this is not a data grid, but the deployment groups, because data grid only shows running instances. And deployment group is like a new way of managing the instances in a cluster. I think that you probably edit instances of Payara server into the data grid, so it means they connected the Hazelcast cluster, but in the deployment groups they won't show up, because they were not edited by the administration console. It's a misconception of how data grids relate to deployment groups. And while data grid is an automatic concept, it means that every instance that joins the Hazelcast cluster will appear in the data grid. The deployment groups have to be added manually if you want to manage instances together, like start them or stop them. And it's used for a different use case. While data grid and session replication with a data grid targets cloud deployments, and especially when you want to scale your cluster up and down according to the needs, while deployment groups are more for granular managing of deployments from administration console, where you provision your instances from the administration console and only add them from the administration interface and not dynamically. So depending on your use case, I would rather use either just data grid and connect instances to it automatically when you want to grow and shrink your cluster dynamically, or if you want to manage them from a central point from a Payara server, you would create a deployment group where you can start and stop instances from the administration console.
Okay, brilliant.
Nice. So I shall hopefully share my screen again. Right, so I'm going to talk about OpenID. Okay. So we've added in support for OpenID Connect. And for those of you who have used the OAuth 2 integration, it's very similar, because for those of you who don't know, OpenID is essentially just a layer on top of OAuth 2. So Gaurav Gupta, I should say, has written an example. He's got an example here under the Java EE samples repo, under the EE samples. Which, so we've donated this to this, so we've actually got a few here, but we've got one for OAuth 2, but OpenID is the one we want to look at. So that's what all these tabs are. But the best way to find out about it, I find, is to look at it, not OpenAPI, OpenID. Why does everything have the word open in it now? It's confusing. Is to look at the documentation. So that's on docs.payara.fish, and then you can just type OpenID. It should be the first one. So everything's essentially done via this annotation here. So if I find it in the actual example, see a more concrete way. So you've got this OpenID authentication definition annotation. So this is just a basic example, as I said, that Gaurav wrote. So we've got provider ID, which is essentially the URL which you're going to go poke to see if you're actually authenticated using your client ID and client secret. And then your redirect is where you're going to go if you are successfully authenticated. So obviously here it's just an extremely simple example where we've got declare roles, servlet security, and just your bog standard Java EE security stuff, and then this added annotation, which is essentially just calling a response, just a get. That's just an unsecured one. And so this, if you missed it, is the actual provider. So this is essentially the authentication. And shoddy indenting, Gareth, shoddy indenting. So you will be going to here. So you've got your /auth, which will go through and take your client ID and authenticate you. So this is actually just the authentication gubbins, which I'm not going to go into in a massive amount because this is essentially, as I said, just authentication gubbins. It's essentially just going, am I authenticated? That's not actually what the OpenID bit is. Get out of the way, Zoom. There we go. And again, get out of the way, Zoom. Thank you. And so, for those of you who don't know as well, OpenID is configured via JSON. So here, obviously, you've got your provider, your endpoint, which is /auth, where it's going to get the token. So Gareth's essentially just stuck everything into the provider, which if you scan through it, obviously this is on GitHub, so you can find it. The URL is up there for those of you who want to have a look. But if you go through this provider class, you'll see there's token, there's user info. Somewhere around there, there'll be auth. Yes, there you go. And you're essentially open. This is just the configuration. There's nothing special there. It's just a configuration, fairly bog standard. So if I find that doc again, there it is. It's obviously available here. This is essentially just describing what I said. Instead, you can actually also get the context of it by injecting the OpenID context. So if you wanted to get your token and stuff, you can grab it from in here. So configuration-wise, we have support for expression language substitution. So instead of doing, if I find it again, yeah. So instead of hard coding that, you could have an expression language statement to grab it from Beam. You could also use MicroProfile config. So you can set that as a property and you grab it from there. And similar for these, you could have these set by MicroProfile config. And we also support the password, the aliasing. So if you don't want to literally write your password or your secret into here, you can use aliases to alias it, to anonymize it, whatever the correct term is. So in combination with that, Google and, down to the wrong place. Google and Azure also have support for this. So here are all the configuration options. So some of there's the top ones there, which are the ones which are in the example there, and then already, and then you've got your scope for which ones are allowed, and the response types, etc., etc. Not going to go through all of them because we're actually over time already. And then there are X parameters if you want to quickly throw some in. And there's expression language and the aliasing. So as I mentioned, Google and Azure. So there's actually alternative annotations which are almost identical. They're just they've got the provider URL kind of essentially already done for you, so you don't have to point it at that. And that's that really. That is the OpenID.
There is a question from Frank Klomp. He asks, is it possible to run several OpenID Connect providers at the same time? For example, Google, Facebook, and a homegrown one?
I didn't implement it, but I want to say yes, as long as you're specifying it on different, in different places. I want to say yes. I don't know for certain though. I don't know that one. I'd have to test it.
Okay. All right. Brilliant.
I would say, I think, I'm not an expert, but I think there is an annotation that can group multiple authentication definitions.
All right.
Yeah, so that would be a way that it would try to identify. But I don't know if it works with OpenID Connect because it requires to redirect to another page. But normally it should work by authenticating against multiple providers. If the first one doesn't work, then we would try the other one. But we can try to create an example.
Yes, we can try and make an example. And if it doesn't work, we can potentially look at adding that as a feature in a future release. Because it sounds like something that should be there if it isn't.
All right, bro. If there's any more questions, please type them down. Otherwise, we will finish up. Unless there's anything else.
Not from me, because the rest of the thing is literally just wrapping up. So to reiterate, as it says, we've got the MicroProfile updates, support for OpenID Connect. I should really say OpenID Connect because OpenID is a separate thing. The admin console improvements and the new application deployment descriptor. I can't remember if Andre mentioned it, but the schema is actually also available from the docs as well. If you scroll down to the appendices, you can see the schema here. Like that. And there's all your schema gubbins.
Brilliant. Well, thank you very much. What I'll send a share of that source code, as you asked, and the PowerPoint presentation in an email with the recording of this webinar as well to all those that signed up. Brilliant. Thank you very much, everyone. Thank you for joining us.
Thanks.
Bye.
Bye.
Goodbye.
How do we stop it?
I didn't stop it. Just people were saying nice things, so that was really nice.
Okay.
Brilliant. Cool. Thanks very much. Thank you, Michael. Bye.
How do I leave on this? Where the hell is the leave? I don't know how to leave. Oh, there, in the bottom.
Oh, someone, what's his name? I can't actually see.
Like, is it already? Is it already stopped?
Yes. Yeah.
Okay, I wasn't sure.
Yeah, it's still recording. Just there was another chat.
There's still people here.
Yeah. Someone was just asking about sharing it, but I said I'll send an email to everyone that registered. The resources discussed today. So you should get that soon as I sort out the recording. Brilliant. Thank you very much.
That's my fault.